I would like to welcome all of you to the 13th Embassy Luncheon. And the Embassy Luncheon is a tradition of the Protection Project where we come together and meet ambassadors, embassy representatives, and share ideas and learn from you. And today, we are devoting this embassy luncheon to a discussion of the 2009 United States State Department Trafficking in Persons report. That means that this is the 9th report. We had 8 reports. This is number 9. And if you take a look at each report, you will find out that everyone is different. Not only because we had 3 ambassadors before Ambassador Ludo Baca, but also because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was amended 3 times. 2003, 2005, 2008. And every time the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is amended, it changes the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking that foreign countries must comply with. The Trafficking in Persons report is really well documented, well written, very comprehensive. I always say it is credible, current, and comprehensive. That is how I describe it by using the 3 C's. Having said that, whether I or you agree with everything in the report, probably not. And we will be hearing from you, those who agree and those who disagree. But to me, the report serves 2 main functions. One, it is a diplomatic tool, a way of engaging governments. And I look forward to your leadership, Mr. Ambassador, in this constructive engagement process. To me, the report engages government in a debate about an important issue, and that is trafficking in persons. But as a member of SAIS, and Dean Jessica probably would agree with me, the report serves another function, and that is, it is to me an educational tool. We learn from it, we refer to it. To me, it is the primary source of information on government efforts to combat trafficking in persons. And here are some of the findings of the report that we highlighted in our review. Every year, as you know, we publish a review on the report. We love the report very much. We have our own review. And this review is available on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at it. But for now, I want to highlight some of the findings that we highlighted in the review based on your report, Mr. Ambassador. First, the report really highlights for us that there is a serious problem of trafficking in children around the world. Children are subject to trafficking in many cases, including child begging, The report refers to the problem of child begging as a form of forced labor in at least 48 countries around the world. Serious problem. Children begging in the street, internally, or children being trafficked from one country to another for the purpose of begging. Amazing. Child soldiers is a problem in at least 13 countries around the world. The number of destination countries for child sex tourism is 27. Again, child sex tourism is a problem. Trafficking for the purpose of domestic service was highlighted in the report as a problem in 95 countries. I don't know, we cannot probably do without domestic servants. I don't know, even here in Washington, D.C., but all over the world, you highlighted the problem of domestic service, 95 countries. Something has to be done about it. 20 of the reported countries, in 20 of the reported countries, female victims are being trafficked for the purpose of forced marriages, because we always focus on commercial sex acts, prostitution, but I like the fact that the report also covered non-commercial sex marriages. And in many parts of the world, females are being trafficked for the purpose of marriage. Cases of child pornography have been reported only in 6 countries, and I want to spend a minute or two on that. Why? If you take a look at the TIP report, they say, well, there is a problem of child pornography in Japan, Honduras, South Africa, you know, the World Cup there, and there's a lot of problems, child pornography. So the question is whether child pornography is only a problem in 6 countries around the world. That's a question mark. Or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act does not require the State Department to report on child pornography. Let me explain why. In 2000, we had nothing on child sex tourism. So if you take a look at the Trafficking in Persons report of the State Department for 5-6 years, nothing was there on child sex tourism. The law was amended, requiring the State Department to ask countries, what are you doing to combat child sex tourism? Here, from SAIS, I suggest that an amendment is warranted in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's about time to include child pornography in our fight against the 4 evils of commercial sexual exploitation of children. The report covers child trafficking, it covers child prostitution, it covers child sex tourism, it does not cover child pornography because the law does not require the report to cover child pornography, and I think the link is there between trafficking and child pornography, and I think the report should cover both. Second, the issue of demand. You cannot do something about trafficking in persons unless you go after the client, the customer, the purchaser of sexual services or cheap labor or a human organ. The report really does an excellent job of addressing the issue of demand. We learned that in at least 48 countries around the world, countries are doing something. There are demand reduction programs. That is the term used by the report. But the report also says that in 82 countries, nothing is being done about demand. I know it's a difficult issue. Would you do prevention, or would you go after the customer and put the customer behind bars? It's a difficult issue, prevention or prosecution, but at least the report highlights the importance of combating and addressing the issue of demand, liability of the customer, the client, the purchaser, especially the purchaser of sexual services. Third, the report highlights to us that there is a huge problem of corruption. 67 countries, there are references there to the issue of corruption. As you know, it's one of the minimum standards. I like the fact that the report spends some time telling us, well, something has to be done in these 67 countries. 4, the report focuses on victims of trafficking, and that's what we say in the anti-trafficking movement. You have to focus on the victims. You have to treat a trafficked person as victims. The report tells us, and this is amazing, that in at least 69 countries around the world, governments are still deporting victims of trafficking. They do not recognize a trafficked person as a victim. In these countries, as the report says, either victims are being deported, or sometimes deported, or may be deported. Something has to be done about the immigration policies in these different countries around the world. 5th, I like the fact that the report covers reporting and monitoring mechanisms. I am from Egypt, proud to be from Egypt. Egypt, by the way, is on T2 watch list. But Egypt just published last year the first annual report on trafficking. I encourage that. I want every country to have its own report on trafficking, monitoring the status of trafficking. Governments and NGOs. The Iraqi Foundation is here. They just published a report, 5-6 pages devoted to the problem of trafficking. The report spends a lot of time on the issue of reporting. I like that very much. 51 countries have these reporting mechanisms, but in 124 countries, no mention of reporting in these countries. So something has to be done about encouraging countries to develop. I'm not talking about coordinating committees. I'm talking about reports. As we have the Trafficking in Persons report published by the State Department, the United States, where is the report of country A and country B and country C? 6, I still have 4 minutes, Mr. Ambassador. And he's looking at me. When he looks at me, that means I have to stop. But I still have 4 or 5 minutes. 6, the role of civil society. And this is an issue that I want to also address with you, because the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act do not say anything about civil society. Here's another amendment that I am suggesting from SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. I want a new minimum standard. We have to ask countries whether a country is cooperating with NGOs and other elements of civil society when they adopt these preventive measures and protective measures. The report does that anyway. 147 countries, the report talks about the cooperation between government and non-government organizations. I like that, but it's not part of the law. It is time to codify this minimum standard, make it an obligation upon countries to cooperate with NGOs, and that's the case. Very few countries you don't find this cooperation. Finally, the status of anti-trafficking legislation, my favorite piece. Except for 13 countries, every country has an anti-trafficking legislation or a draft. That is something. From 2000 to 2009, there has been a significant legislative movement all over the world. Some countries, 59 of them, adopt a more comprehensive type law, prevention, protection, prosecution, and we add participation and provision and all that. And in at least 76 countries, there is a provision in the criminal code making trafficking a crime. Iraq has a draft law now, but if you take these draft laws out, only 13, maybe 15 countries, my goodness, that means that with legislation, Mr. Ambassador, we're done. However, when you take a look at the report does not make from that fact that there is a legislative movement the fact that countries are doing okay. That raises the question, drafting a law versus implementation of the law. So we have laws, and we have been working on laws, and the State Department has been working on laws helping countries since 2000. But are we implementing these laws? Here are the findings. I'm going to stop with these findings. According to the report, only 28 countries are doing okay, doing fine. So the report covers 173 countries. Only 28 countries are placed on Tier 1. Otherwise, God help us, and God help the United States of America. 76 countries are placed on Tier 2. I don't know what Mr. Ambassador makes of Tier 2. Tier 2 means, well, something is being done, but not enough. But it's a problem. 52 countries are placed on Tier 2 watch list, including Egypt. That's why the Egyptians are upset. And when you talk about 52 countries on Tier 2 watch list, you have a huge problem. And then 17 countries are placed on Tier 3, including our good friends in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. So, with that, without further delay, let me move the microphone to Ambassador Lou de Baca. But few words about the ambassador. Since I talked about 10, 15 minutes on the report, I talked 2 minutes about the ambassador. Because the ambassador is a close friend of mine and an old friend. I know Lou de Baca since 2000 because he was one of the first who worked on the issue of trafficking. And in 2000, he was prosecuting cases of trafficking at a time when many of us did not really understand the concept of trafficking in persons itself. As you all know, Ambassador Lou served as the chief counsel of the Civil Rights Divisions of Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. He was a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. He was honored many times. I'll mention 3 so I can give you time to talk. Ambassador Lou was honored with the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award for his work on United States versus Kilsoli. Difficult case, and thank you for prosecuting that case. Ambassador Lou was also honored with the Attorney General's John Marshall Award for his work in the Kadena case. We all learned trafficking following what you did in the Kadena case, a sex trafficking case, Florida, Texas, a really important case. And finally, he was also honored with the Freedom Network's Paul and Sheila Wellstone Award for his diligent service as a public servant to victims of trafficking. Please help me welcome Ambassador Lou de Baca.
Thank you, and I would like to thank the Protection Project and Johns Hopkins for hosting once again the Embassy Luncheon. I think that this is an important way that we can come together as colleagues to talk about, in this case, the issues of human trafficking around this year's report. I love the fact that Dr. Mattar announced the 3 C's as far as what he gleaned from this year's report. Because I think that we are immeasurably served in the counter-trafficking world by these frameworks. We have the 3 Cs now. We have the 3 Ps of prevention, protection, prosecution, joined by a 4th that Secretary Clinton announced last week when she was rolling out the trafficking report, and then also in her op-ed in the Washington Post, which is that 4th P of partnerships. Sometimes we talk about the 3 Rs with rescuing, restoring, rehabilitating. But at the end of the day, I think that one of the things that we've all been touched with in our work against trafficking in persons is what I'm going to call the 2 Ms, which is Mohamed Mattar. The notion of his work, and I want to make sure that we have it. As Dr. Mattar said, I've prosecuted a few of these cases, and more importantly, I think, in the mid-1990s, in the wake of the Beijing Conference on the Status of Women, as Argentina and others were first coming into to UNODC and other processes and saying we'd like to have a new international instrument that can update the way that we're thinking about trafficking in persons, which for many years was kind of the leftovers of the, for lack of a better word, the white slave trafficking law that had been put into place in the late 1800s in many countries around the world. The notion of having the slavery conventions over here, the prostitution convention over there, forced labor conventions, everything was kind of willy-nilly. And the one thing that a number of countries started working on in the late 1990s was that notion of how do you bring together all of these things around that 3P paradigm, making it so that it's not simply the sovereignty of the country, which is the border approach that should be protected, but rather that it's the rights of the victim that should be protected. And I think that when you reframe the human trafficking issue as this notion of everybody in the world has a certain set of human rights that travel with them, no matter where they go, or even if they don't go anywhere, and one of those is the right to be free, a violation of those rights then falls upon the government as the guarantor of human rights, of civil rights, to then address that. And that's certainly what, in the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, I'm going to embarrass a few of my former colleagues who are here from the Civil Rights Division, and Antoinette Acquis and Hillary Axsom. One of the things that just, I think by their mere presence here demonstrates, the notion of a victim witness coordinator, somebody who is focused on the needs of the victims, and then at the same time, the prosecutor who is vindicating the rights of the state. Now, it's not vindicating the rights of the state against the fact that someone crossed the border with contraband, that contraband being a slave, that contraband being an illegal alien, that contraband being someone in prostitution. Those are the old ways of thinking about this problem. The Palermo Protocol, which grew up out of this mid-1990s thought, takes it away from that notion about it being the state's interests in the border, and instead, it's the state's interests in the rights of the people. And I think that that's actually a very big leap on the part of the Palermo Protocol, but from it flows this notion that protection and prevention are co-equal with prosecution, which certainly then is an interesting thing for a prosecutor to work on. And one of the things that I recall as we were working on those cases that Dr. Mattar talked about, the Cadena case, some of the other early cases, whether it's the El Monte case of the people who were chained to their sewing machines in Los Angeles, whether it was domestic servant cases all over the country, whether it was the replacing of African Americans in servitude in the fields of the South with Latin Americans, sometimes in the exact same fields, working for the exact same farmers, but with very similar coercive force being used against them. One of the things that was interesting that I have a hard time forgetting was being in a meeting with other parts of the U.S. government and having one of the cabinet agencies come in and say, there is no human trafficking in the United States. I had actually just gotten off a plane from Florida where I was working on one of these cases. I had just left from the detention center where one of the traffickers was actually admitting to me what he had done and how they had trapped these people. And so then I, get on the plane, come back to Washington, D.C., and then go into this meeting where someone tells me, in all good faith, they truly believe this, that no, this doesn't happen in the U.S. And I think that that's something that if we look at it 10 years later, as far as what the U.S. government now is doing on trafficking, not just around the world, but also on our efforts to combat trafficking here in the United States, I would hope that we would not get that kind of reaction. And I think that that's something that each country has to take those steps. And sometimes it goes through that, we don't have it, or let's define it in a way that we can think about it as something that happens to others. So one of the things that I think that we've seen is that since the signing of the TVPA in 2000, through the signing of the Palermo Protocol, this switch from the leadership of the Clinton administration to the intensification that we saw under the Bush administration, and now with the Obama administration taking that forward, the fight against modern slavery, both here and around the world. And so I think that having Secretary of State Clinton kind of back in the saddle, as it were, on trafficking, which she had been such a champion on the anti-trafficking fight when she was First Lady, I think that actually bodes well for our own internal fight against human trafficking. And I think that hopefully her example and her willingness to engage with other countries is going to have that openness and that notion of the partnership that she so much wants to bring to this. Rather than this report being seen as an annual finger-wagging exercise or anything like that, the notion that the report is a diagnostic tool that identifies things that can be looked at, identifies places where not just the U.S. but other countries as well, and even countries without the U.S. being in the middle of their bilateral relationship can engage upon. So one of the things that we would hope is that donor nations who are in the report, whether they're Tier 1, Tier 2, or otherwise, would be able to then look at this as a diagnostic tool as they channel their programs, as they look at their law enforcement cooperation, as they look at their international aid, that they'd be able to have this snapshot as well as far as that tool is concerned. So it's not just the United States using this as a diagnostic tool, but other countries as well. I think one of the things that we've seen and that I think that the report reflects, not just in the narratives but also in some of the rankings as well, is that notion of how we need to see past these issues of migration and instead look at the exploitation that the United Nations has, through the protocol, placed at the core of the phenomenon. And so, again, it's not an issue of movement and violation of borders, but rather is about that use of coercive force, whether it's overt force, whether it's psychological, whether it's structural, whether it's taking people's passports. It can run the entire gamut of some type of coercive conduct in order to hold someone in that condition of service. And the condition of service can be in something that would be otherwise a valid form of labor, such as working in the fields, working in a factory, working in domestic servants, or it can be something that we would not consider labor, such as prostitution, such as in the pornography industry, some of these different things that we would not consider to be valid forms of labor, but nevertheless there's a master-servant relationship. And one of the things that we've seen is that the demand for those products, whether it's a product of the cheap goods or commercial sex or what have you, then ends up being filled by the abusive, whether it's an employer or the exploitative panderers or whoever. It ends up being filled in a way that maximizes their profit. And one of the ways to maximize the profit is to make sure that your people don't run away. And at the end of the day, that's, I think, kind of the layperson's understanding, and I think it's also reflected in the international norms. So that notion of whether or not the crime is an exploitation-based or migration-based crime, I think is something that, as we look at the country narratives, focusing in perhaps on countries that would often think of, well, trafficking is a transit issue through our country, and then the narrative ends up having things saying, well, okay, but what are you doing about the folks from your own country who this is happening to without ever having left the village or whatever, without ever having left to go to another country? And so I think that that's something that, again, as Dr. Mattar said, the notion of signing the Palermo Protocol, having domestic legislation, very important, but then actually going out and using it in all of the various aspects and manifestations of trafficking in persons. One of the things in the introduction of the report this year that we talk about are what are those various forms of trafficking in persons? And so there's, I think, the things that people would normally immediately say, sex trafficking, child sexual exploitation, forced labor of someone from another country. But then the report itself digs down deeper into that notion of involuntary servitude, forced labor where somebody hasn't moved at all, the notion of the street children, the begging rings, et cetera. So I think that one of the things that we're looking at in the report and one of the things that we're looking at in our diplomacy is all of the aspects of the Palermo Protocol and all of the aspects of trafficking and whether those are being addressed by particular countries. At the end of the day, as we look at this notion of coercion in a time of economic crisis, we see two concurrent trends, a shrinking global demand for labor and then a growing supply of workers who, because there's not as ready opportunities to migrate, willing to take ever greater risks for economic opportunities. I think some have perhaps heard me give this example, but I'll take the prerogative of the microphone to point out that one of the things that we've seen is that there was a demand for East Asian labor in Eastern Europe that follows on the heels of Eastern Europeans having gone to Western Europe to fill the demand for cheap labor. Women from Eastern Europe ending up in Western Europe in prostitution, men ending up in the construction industry, then suddenly being replaced by a new flow from even farther east. As that other flow comes back, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to these Chinese communities or other Asian communities that suddenly have surprised everyone in Poland or other parts of Eastern Europe. But again, it's that notion of the markets are opening up and the abusive traffickers then fill them with trafficked persons. Those markets, again, don't happen unless there is some kind of demand for the thing that is being offered. I think that one of the things that we've seen, the ILO has pointed out that the problems of forced labor in a global economy then fall, not surprisingly, once again, hardest upon the most vulnerable. Racial and ethnic minorities, women, children, people who are displaced. Again, it's that notion of conditions of hardship allow them, or demand, I should say, that they end up taking risks that they might not would have taken otherwise. And I think that that's one of the things that we see is that if they are the most vulnerable to begin with, then they are most likely to fall through the cracks as far as victim identification. One of the things that we see and that we're always working on in the report is this notion of going to a country and saying, well, it seems that you have a trafficking problem with this particular population, and then the pushback is, oh, well, no, they're just a bunch of illegal migrants, or they're a bunch of folks with, false claims to asylum here. Might be true. We don't really know one way or the other whether that's the case. But even if they are a bunch of, quote unquote, a bunch of illegal migrants or false claims to asylum, one still has to look whether or not they're being enslaved. And if they are being enslaved, then under Palermo, under other international law instruments, and I think under just a good government and a good law enforcement response, you then have to figure out how do you help those people. But again, it's that notion that I think the U.S. has traveled over the last 10 or 15 years as well, saying if somebody is here as an illegal alien and it turns out that they are held as a slave, then we need to engage with them as though they are first and foremost a victim of human trafficking. We'll deal with the immigration issues only as a diagnostic response, figuring out what we need to do for that person, rather than using that first to deny them any kind of protections for being a trafficking victim. I think that that's one of the things that we'd certainly would like to see more of is that aggressive screening, rather than moving people off into other categories of, oh, they're just from another country or what have you. So too, though, I think that we, then the flip side of that is that it is hard to sometimes to get countries to look at their own citizens, their own domestic trafficking problem. We're certainly grappling with that in the United States. That's something that we're looking at as far as how can we better get services to U.S. citizen trafficking victims, and how can we find trafficking victims in the U.S. Again, we have to move past stereotypes. I think people would be surprised that some of the trafficking cases that the Civil Rights Division has done in the last 10 years involving U.S. citizens are not simply the stereotype of street prostitution, which obviously is a place with, I think, a very fertile soil for traffickers to operate, but also cases involving white Americans on a farm, cases involving African Americans picking fruit and being exploited because of their drug addiction, cases involving women having to work on pornographic websites, both as the models, but then also as the computer, not programmer, but I guess the web administrators and things like that. So there's been some interesting cases involving U.S. citizens that aren't just the stereotype, which to me suggests that while we need to look at the places where we think we're going to find it and will find it, such as street prostitution, we also need to think about where are people domestically being enslaved. And when I say we, I don't just mean the United States. I think that that's something that each country has to wrestle with, rather than trying to define it as a problem of migrants coming through. One of the things that's encouraging in the report, and I think that I'm not, after that wonderful lunch, I'm not in the mood to focus on the discouraging parts of the report other than in a flyover. But some of the encouraging things that we've seen in the report is this notion of anti-trafficking legislation in 26 new countries this year. Again, as Dr. Mattar said, we will now look to see, having built the bicycle, are people going to take it out for a ride? Anti-trafficking legislation that goes unused is not something that I think we are going to be looking at as far as tier determinations, because it's the actual use of the anti-trafficking legislation that matters. The political will is where we see that, and I think it's in the implementation stage. One thing that our research, based on the reporting of numbers directly from countries, has raised for us is the question of the difference in numbers between victims identified, cases investigated, and cases prosecuted, and how we can increase the number of cases prosecuted at the end of the day, how we can make it so the cases investigated more closely matches the victims identified. And this is a stair step, and it's a stair step not just in other countries, it's also a stair step that's reflected in the U.S., in that there is a difference between those three. And I think that we want to engage upon that. We want to try to figure out where we can improve so that that number of cases that are coming in and the number of cases that are making it through the system are more the same. Finally, one thing that I would like to point out about this year's report is this notion of the guest worker programs. I think it's something that you see a lot of in the report, in no small part because the guest worker programs around the world, I think, are under strain due to the global economic crisis. One of the things that we've recognized both in the TIP office and then also on Capitol Hill over the last couple of years is how guest worker programs often render an already vulnerable population that much more vulnerable to what a trafficker might do to them. It's as though everyone typically starts out kind of here, and then they don't cross the line into being held against their will or being enslaved until something happens to them. Whereas guest workers, far from home, often having borrowed a lot of money in order to pay the brokers to even get the job, sometimes bound to work for that person by the government that issues the guest worker visa, the guest worker starts off much closer to slipping over into that exploitative relationship. And we've seen that in the United States with our guest worker programs. We're seeing that in other countries that have large guest worker programs. And it's something that I think had an impact on a number of tier rankings this year and is reflected in a number of narratives. Now, in the United States, one of the things that we've been trying to do to address these problems in the guest worker programs, for instance, just last week, this brochure, which unfortunately I only have one of them because we've sent them all out to the field, but this brochure is, and we will have more later, but for the moment we tried to get them out to the consular officers. For visa applicants who are coming to the United States to work or study under our guest worker laws, they are now going to be given this by the U.S. consular officials, and it'll be reviewed. And when I was interviewing the women from northeastern China, who were kind of foreigners in their own land to begin with, because they were ethnically Korean, living in that portion of China that's up against the border. So the Koreans didn't really want to claim them, and the Chinese didn't really want to claim them. They came to the United States. First of all, they didn't know that the part of the United States they were coming to was 6,000 miles from the rest of the United States. They thought they were coming to the United States. So a difference of understanding between them and the trafficker. They thought that they were going to be able to earn a certain amount of money, and that ended up being false. They thought that they were going to work as waitresses, when in fact they were put to a karaoke bar as hostesses and forced to submit to prostitution. They thought that once they got on the island, if something bad happened, that they would be able to seek help from their consulate or from someone else. And what happened instead was the trafficker, whose son had actually gone to high school in Saipan, made sure that the women saw his son talking with his friends, who were then, they were in their mid-20s, and they had joined the police force on the island. And so his son would end up just talking about the basketball game or what was going on that weekend or anything like that with the local police. But then they'd come back and they'd say, oh yeah, we were just telling those cops that, if they see you anywhere else on the island, that they need to make sure that they scoop you up and bring you back. And so again, it's this notion of information, the information disparity between the traffickers and their victims. So we often see that, and I think that that's one of the reasons why, unfortunately, many of the cases in the U.S. and many of the cases that we see worldwide, the trafficker is actually of the same ethnicity or of the same national origin as the victim, and it's often a notion of selling them on this idea of a better life, and then surfing in that gap of information between the trafficker and the victim. And so that's one of the things that our guest worker pamphlet, a pamphlet by itself cannot solve all the problems of the world, but we're hoping that it's one of those things that it can actually address some of the information gap between the traffickers and the victims. The labor brokers, I think, are something that we paid great attention to in this report. And I think that it's one of those things that we see not just in the countries that one would expect, but there are a number of countries that labor brokers are active in, and they are charging people 2-3 years worth of salaries in order to get the job to begin with. And then finally, other than the guest worker programs, I'd also like to point out exactly the point that Dr. Mattar was able to glean from the report, and that is the particular vulnerabilities of children. I think that that's something that we see over and over, and I think that one of the things that's important about looking at children through the trafficking lens, as opposed to some of the other lenses of other international instruments, is that the trafficking lens at the end of the day views this as a crime for whom someone needs to be punished, for whom someone needs to go to jail. And I think that that's something that we need to continue to think about, because on the one hand, we have very effective structures and a lot of foreign assistance, not just in the U.S., but other donor nations, spending money, time, and energy on the worst forms of child labor. And I think that we need to continue those and even intensify those processes. The processes, whether it's trying to get kids out of the workforce and back into school, whether it's trying to clean up the supply chain that surrounds the worst forms of child labor, whether it's working in a multi-sectoral manner with civil society, whether it's unions or otherwise, to try to clean up these situations. So I think that the ILO processes and the addressing the worst forms of child labor is critical. But at the end of the day, I think that the counter-trafficking responsibilities as well need to be put into that mix, so that it's not that there's an ILO process here and a trafficking process here, one of which is by the ILO and the other of which is by the Palermo Protocol, but rather thinking about the entire spectrum. And when you have children who are enslaved, the people who did that, there's only one place that they should be at the end of the day, and that's in prison. And so I think that that's something that we can look at. That's something that without trying to undercut any of these other processes, but that notion of incorporating the trafficking way of thinking into some of the other international instruments that are out there. So in conclusion, I think that one of the things that we've seen from the trafficking report, and I'm very enthusiastic about the responses, both happy and not so happy, that we've gotten from countries, because even I think the countries that could have been happier about the country narratives or about the rankings themselves, we'll be able to work with as colleagues on this, as we, the United States, admit some of our own problems, but then also reach out with that notion that we're going to be actually engaging and really rolling up our sleeves. Next week, as of Sunday, I'm going to be visiting 3 countries in Africa, and I think that I'm very enthusiastic about being able to go to Swaziland, and even a short trip, but I think a way that we can engage and really start to partner on this as far as what kind of work I can do as law enforcement to law enforcement with my counterparts there, but also then with South Africa and then with Nigeria. And I think that Nigeria is a good place to close my remarks on, because Nigeria was a Tier 2 watch list country a few years ago. It was a country that where things didn't work, where corruption, frankly, was enough of a problem that even nascent anti-trafficking efforts would suddenly get bogged down. At this point, however, with the creation of NAPTIP, which is the National Anti-Trafficking Police Unit, the prosecutors that work with that police unit, we see this steady and now increasing number of prosecutions of traffickers. The corruption does not seem to be stopping cases anymore. Victims are being interviewed in a way that actually understands what they've been through, as opposed to what all too often happens with a kind of a rough policeman type of an approach. And this is something that's happened because of political will. It's something that's happened because of founding a standalone trafficking unit and engaging on all the issues, whether it's child domestic servants, whether it's prostitution, whether it's other forms of compelled service. And I think that it's that kind of energy that we see how a country which is at one point one step away from Tier 3 now is a Tier 1 country. And so it's a journey that I think it's not something that we did. It's a journey that Nigeria took, and I think that that's a great example for governments that want to engage on the issue. So again, thank you for your attendance. I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that unlike the years in which I could go to a meeting within the U.S. government and have somebody say there is no such thing as trafficking, or we'd work with the NGOs, but we don't think there are any NGOs that are working on trafficking. I think that one of the things that we see now is that there is a global movement against this problem, and that working together we'll be able to abolish slavery once and for all. Thank you.
That was a perfect example, by the way. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for this analysis of the problem: exploitation, migration, disruption of international markets, a supply problem or a demand problem. But I think I want to spend some time with you, move the microphone to the floor, a period of discussion and debate. Those who agree and those who disagree. I don't know whether there's anybody from Nigeria here to celebrate with us. They're probably busy celebrating in Nigeria, Tier 1. But
I hope they're doing cases today. Is what they're
I see the ambassador of Oman, the ambassador of Morocco, and we'll start taking questions. So if you have a question, please use the side microphone, introduce yourself, and yeah, questions and criticism maybe will be fine.
Hi. Oops. EJ Cho with the Voice of America. What are your recommendations for both the North Korean and Chinese governments regarding North Korean women's sex trafficking in China? And how is the U.S. government engaging with the North Korean government to improve the human trafficking situation, or how are you pressuring the North Korean government?
The North Korean government, as we see it at this point, has not necessarily taken even the first step to addressing a trafficking problem, which is admitting that there's a trafficking problem. I think that one of the things that we would like to see and in our recommendations for North Korea would be the notion that returned migrants, whether they're forcibly deported by the Chinese or whether they're folks who are coming home, actually get treated as potential trafficking victims. Not everybody is a trafficking victim, obviously, but I think that one of the things that we see is the lack of screening that I mentioned, not just punishing them for having left the country, which is something that so often happens when someone comes back to North Korea having been exploited in the sex industry in China or in the construction industry. A number of men after the Olympics were kind of discarded back across the border, and they weren't screened to find out whether there was any forced labor or whether they'd suffered anything. One of the things that we see with North Korea, and as you know, we have our kind of a few other issues with North Korea right now, and I won't go into the how we're dealing directly with the North Koreans, but one of the other issues that we see with North Korea is this notion of government-sponsored labor export. The labor brokers that I mentioned earlier render people vulnerable enough just because of the structure of the labor exporters. But when the labor exporter is actually an authoritarian government and they themselves are the ones who are exporting the labor, I think that that's something that we see in a very different light. And that's something that we've seen recently with the government of North Korea as far as using government resources specifically to draft and send workers abroad into basically government-to-government level job sharing. Now, one of the things that we've seen that was heartening was that the Czech government actually canceled their contract with the North Koreans because they were very concerned of this prospect of the North Koreans sending political officers or other security forces along with their workers to make sure that nobody committed any troublemaking. In effect, basically what was happening is that the government themselves were providing the means of coercion that was then happening in the factories, and the Czech government canceled their participation in there. I think that one of the things that we think needs to be done is, at a minimum, both China and North Korea need to allow UNHCR to do the type of refugee screening and asylum screening that it does so productively in other countries, not just to find out whether these are trafficking victims, but also to see whether there are valid asylum claims that should be done with that population. But having used the example of Chinese Koreans, I think that one of the things that I'd also certainly like to see is that notion of China engaging not just with the Koreans as foreigners, but also engaging with the sizable minority population in their northeast who are ethnically Koreans, but Chinese nationals. They are a ripe target for traffickers, especially the women, because they are able to be used in the sex industry in the Koreas and in other parts of Asia that serve Koreans. And because they're they're not necessarily stateless, I don't want to use that term of art, but they're kind of folks without a country in China. And that is kind of a recipe for trafficking, especially if you've got an underutilized female population, which is what we see with the Chinese Koreans.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Andrea Vessa with the American Bar Association. Thank you for coming out, Mr. Ambassador. My question refers to the State Department report. And although not required by the TVPA and its amendments, will we see more and more information in the coming years about United States efforts? Not just to set forth credibility, but also set forth methodology, if you will, of what we require in the reporting of other countries.
Well, I would certainly call everyone's attention. I should have this page memorized, but I don't. I'd call everyone's attention to the first country narrative in the report, which is on page 57, which is the U.S. government country narrative. And I think that that's something that you'll see next year that is going to track the other country narratives a little more directly, including the notion, as Secretary Clinton has suggested, that it's time for the United States to rank itself as well. Now, as both student and teacher, I guess, ranking us, I think that that's going to be a bit of a challenge. And I think that for the United States to rank itself, to have any credibility with you all, as far as what that credibility or what that ranking should be, I think is going to require feedback from other governments, feedback from non-governmental organizations, from the academy. And I think that that's something that I'm going to be looking at in the coming months so that we can start setting up that feedback mechanism. Otherwise, I could go in the back room and come up with a ranking, but I don't think that that's something that we should necessarily do as far as transparency is concerned. As far as transparency in the United States, I hope that people have looked at or can go online and look at the U.S. government report, which came out at the same time. This is much more the raw data. It's less of the analysis. It's less of the structure of a country narrative. But this is a level of raw data that, frankly, if we saw this kind of raw data, 90 pages of the kind of unfiltered information, if we saw that kind of raw data from every country in the world, I think that the trafficking report would be a much better product. And we certainly encourage every country to undertake this type of a top-down review. And this is a top-down review that the United States takes every year, every spring. And I think that that's the kind of thing that, as Dr. Mattar talked about, one of the things that we comment on in the country narratives is the extent to which data is available, to the extent to which data is gathered. And I think that the notion that countries would do a very transparent assessment of their own situation is something that we would look very favorably on as far as the rankings are concerned. One of the things that I'd like to call everyone's attention to, and perhaps we can put it on the agenda for the 14th Embassy Luncheon in 2010.
Yes, sir.
Is on the in the U.S. government report on page 7 are the fiscal year 2009 recommendations, and those are laid out. Some of them are relatively tough. The United States saying that we need to deal with our own issues as far as turf considerations between different parts of the government. But I think that these are things that we've put out there not only as things that we hope to be able to work on, but we encourage feedback from all of you as far as, come to us next spring. Tell us what you have seen as far as those recommendations. Tell us how we're doing. We want to put those out there for the world to comment on because we think that that's going to be a much more transparent way for us to engage. When I say transparent, I don't mean pain-free. But I'm willing to take a few hits on this for us to get out and get our goals out for everyone.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take a question from Egypt, and then we'll move to you.
Okay, I'm sorry, say again, myself?
We're going to go Egypt and then you.
Okay, got you.
Thank you.
I wish to thank Dr. Mattar and Ambassador Baca
I wish to thank the speakers for the information that they gave us today and for this lovely luncheon. The point that I want to raise, it has nothing to do with a criticism or agreement or disagreement. The point that I want to raise here, that Cairo, I think, is concerned about the methodology of the report, being very active for the last 2 or 3 years on this, tackling this issue and try to find a solution for it. As you mentioned, Ambassador, it's a global movement and everybody is looking at it. And having I wouldn't exaggerate to say that Egypt now is playing a major role in combating the trafficking problem. We have been engaged with the American embassy in Cairo for the last few years. And as you know, that the First Lady has its own initiative to combat the trafficking. But we still see the report is placing Egypt in the second-tier watch list, something which we are not happy with at all, because we would expected that the report will acknowledge all the progress that Egypt has done, and the report should be encouraging tool, not a pressuring one, on the countries, and even to some extent threatening to go to the one of the following categories, or to using the tool of the aid for with some countries. So this is the concern that I want to raise with you, and to see what's your comment on some countries that keep cooperating with the United States on this report, and then they don't see any reward in return. So what's the point of continuing the cooperation, and then there is no result or positive result in this regard? Thank you.
I think one of the things that we look to, and I do, without getting into the substance of the Egypt narrative, do want to laud the efforts of the First Lady as far as her international engagement on this issue. I think that it's one of the things that we want to continue to support, that type of engagement. One of the things that I'd say writ large, as far as how we look at the countries, first of all, engagement, cooperation, how much people are looking at this, whether it's in international fora or otherwise. But then at the end of the day, we go back to the raw data. And I think that one of the things that we're looking for is where are the cases, where are the victims being served, how many people are being prosecuted, and whether or not there are alternatives to deportation in countries which have problems where the victims are often from another country. And I think that that's something that we are looking to engage upon with everyone. I think that those are at the end of the day, those are the roots to, not that this should be, teaching to the test, or countries should not simply be taking actions to end up on a different tier, but that notion of things that will be given great weight, and that's spelled out at the end of the report, what the minimum standards are. I think the greatest weight in the minimum standards by statute end up being given to the law enforcement efforts, and specifically how many cases are actually being prosecuted. And I think that a lot of times what you'll see is that there will be countries that they end up having what we consider to be, kind of a tier 2 plus, or a tier 2 minus, or a tier 2 watch list plus, some movement within that category. And they might hang there for a little bit while they're putting all of the structures in place. But then once those structures are all in place, you then see kind of a jolt upwards, because then everything starts to work. And I think that that's one of the things that we've seen, whether it's with legal reform, whether it's with, starting to put together referral mechanisms, victim identification, et cetera. Those at times can take a little while to happen, and we don't necessarily upgrade a country for promising to do that. We don't upgrade a country even necessarily for passing the law or implementing or putting out the regulation, but rather we're going to look to see when the law actually gets used, are we then seeing traffickers end up in prison? Are we seeing children being back with their families and having better outcomes? are we seeing victims who are being served? So I think that that's the kind of the explanation so that people can understand what it is that you know, when a country is on a tier for a while, it's not because we don't think anything is being done. It's sometimes one of the reasons is that we're looking to see whether the things that they're putting into place are then going to show some actual results. So that's, I think, the, you know, to the why should we continue to be engaged. I think that engagement pays off at the end of the day with much more professionalized law enforcement and counter-trafficking efforts.
Okay. It's a long answer, but we are recording everything, so I'll give you a copy of these recommendations. So don't worry about it. I know you have to go. Okay, this side, sir, you have been patient, so thank you so much.
Yeah, Richard Finney with Radio Free Asia. I'd like to ask about the trafficking of Laotian women into China. Now, is it commercial sex or forced marriage that's driving that mainly? And is the Laotian government doing anything at all effective to stop that? Thank you.
Well, you know, I think that what we've seen is that the main destination country for Lao trafficking victims is actually Thailand. It's, you know, next door, cultural and linguistic similarities, et cetera, and frankly, better economic conditions. You go to China and you're competing against, you know, an awful lot of folks who are destabilized now from the closure of so many of those factories in the southeast. But we have heard about trafficking of Laotians to China, for instance, for bride trafficking. This notion, as Dr. Mattar mentioned, trafficking for forced marriage. There are also a number of cases that we see out of Laos that start as voluntary migration. Again, that notion of, is there a recruiter in Laos that's grabbing folks and taking them to enslave them, or is it Laotians who are moving on their own and then get abused and enslaved in the country that they end up in? It's a little hard to figure out just how prevalent that trend is. But I think that one of the things that we're seeing with those infrastructure projects, linking Laos to China, you know, bringing in Vietnam and other countries in the Mekong region, we're going to be seeing, I think, an increased vulnerability to trafficking. It's not simply going to be hill tribes in the northwest going down into Thailand necessarily. And it looks as though, and this is reflected in the report, that those infrastructure projects are having a bit of a destabilizing effect. And you're starting to see Laos not simply being a sending country, not simply seeing folks, whether in forced prostitution or in forced marriage, but actually you're starting to see a bit of a transit country effect as well in Laos. So I think that, you know, again, globalization, the effective development, you know, and all in all a net gain, but especially when you open up a highway or other infrastructure, it starts bringing in its wake trafficking and other opportunistic actors. Excuse me? Well, I think that, you know, what we've seen as far as the Laotian government is, you know, as we often see in the developing world, a number of international organizations are operating in the Mekong region, and a lot of the efforts that I've been able to observe in Laos are more a matter of cooperating with the internationals as opposed to necessarily having a standalone Laotian presence. You know, they've got a good law, Article 134 of their penal code. I think that, you know, we've seen some good activity against sex trafficking. I think they had 15 or 18 cases somewhere in that region. Maybe not as much police corruption as would be stereotypical for many of the Mekong areas, but enough police corruption that it's something that we noted in the report and that we're concerned about how that actually affects their ability to prosecute the sex trafficking cases.
Should we make it easy for everybody? Should we take the questions one time and then let Lou answer? We have like 10 minutes left. Let's start with Jennifer. Yeah, everyone. Huh?
Should we jump to the ambassador?
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, you want to take the floor? Okay, okay. I'll let Jennifer ask the question, then everyone, and then Lou will have a chance to just make comments and wrap the whole thing. So, Jennifer, would you let Mr. Ambassador speak first?
Of course.
That's fine. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I won't be long. Thanks very much. Thanks for the remarks you made earlier on, and I'm delighted, Mr. Director, you're going to my country. As you know, we are very, very concerned. I'm seeing this report for the first time. I haven't seen the previous reports. So for me, it's a question of being in a learning curve. I wish I would have seen the previous ones so that I compare whether we are regressing or progressing. I know that my country has put up a legislation. Whether it has gone through Parliament, I'm not sure, but I was told that there is a legislation that is going on. But please, I've spoken to everybody. The wish is that we be as transparent as possible. The population is small, the country is small. We are between two big countries. They are tier 2 and we are tier 3. We can't understand. So as an ambassador, I feel there is something wrong. There should be something obvious that you should point at and say, here it is. So I'm not questioning the credibility, but all I'm saying, can we be helped to move forward and address the issues as they are, so that because this is a problem that we cannot, allow to go on indefinitely.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mattar. Always a pleasure. And Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited about your unique, different perspective that you are bringing to the State Department. I am passionate about prevention and demand, and I'm really happy to see that the report really started to address those issues. And I was hoping you might speak for a moment about another report that was mandated in the TVPA 05, which was the link between commercial sex industry and trafficking. And I was hoping you could give us a status on what is happening with that report, because I'm really excited to see it. Thank you.
Should we do both, just quick hits, or just do everybody? Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nicole Prasad. I'm with the Embassy of Mexico. I just wanted to find out what you thought about the U.S. relations with Mexico in terms of immigration and how that's related to human trafficking and how we can combat this in the future.
Thank you. My boss, yeah, of course, yeah, Professor Guswatch.
Your colleague.
So, go ahead.
Well, I was first have to say I was, again, teasing the ambassador. I didn't think anybody could be as good as Mark Legon, but he shows every sign of being the peer. I just had a request, I guess, more than a question, which is that coercion does come in many forms. I am loath, oftentimes, to send my girl children to work at the United Nations for fear of what will happen to them in employment situations. And the UN still, I regret to say, despite the care of Kofi and the care of Ban Ki-moon, is a tier 4, make it a tier 5 place for females to work because of the coercive sexual act. It really, if you haven't been there, it's no one's married in Bosnia. That's the joke. But it has a fifth world attitude toward allowing females to have career paths that don't, at some time or other, involve very serious sexual coercion at every level of the organization. So I guess I would implore you to use your unique perspective to make sure that that issue stays alive at the UN and all the other international organizations. And ditto what Jane Hall-Lute was trying to do with peacekeeping, that sexual coercion and traffic sex with peacekeepers is something that PKO has never taken particularly seriously. They're sent home for discipline, not disciplined in place, and nobody tracks which countries discipline their peacekeepers for commercial sex. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Introduce yourself. I know you, but maybe some of those who are here do not know you. Okay.
Rendell Rahim, I'm the Executive Director of the Iraq Foundation. Professor Mattar, Ambassador, thank you very much for a very interesting session. I have a question about methodology, actually. In your report, do you evaluate the preventative legislation that is adopted by countries to cut down on human trafficking? And in particular, do you assess the impact of such legislation on other human rights issues in that country? And I want to give you an example, perfect or imperfect. In Iraq, we have legislation on the books that require women who apply for a passport to have the signature of a male relative of the first degree, what is called a mahram, in other words, father or, well, it could be a husband or father or a son or brother. And similar legislation also says that if women are traveling, they have to travel with a mahram. They can't travel on their own. Now, in the women's rights movement, to which I belong, we have argued that this actually violates the rights of women in Iraq. And the answer has always come back that this legislation is on the books to cut down on human trafficking because a lot of people sort of buy women and young girls and so on and take them abroad and use them as prostitutes. So do you evaluate whether such legislation can violate other types of human rights, and is that in your report? Thank you.
Okay, excellent question. Michelle?
Thank you. Michelle Clark with the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Mr. Ambassador, again, congratulations, and I look forward to inviting you to be a guest speaker in the human trafficking course I teach there. I was so interested in the previous question that I almost forgot my own. One of the assignments I gave to the students in the trafficking course this semester was to conduct a public opinion survey. And so we gathered data on what 400 students and faculty around the GW campus thought about human trafficking. 85% ranked it as an extremely important issue when asked to choose among extremely important, somewhat important in the world. But then we came to the question, given a variety of pressing issues, including AIDS, the environment, economic recovery, Darfur, and a few others, where would you place human trafficking in allocating resources, both human resources and financial resources, in helping to remedy the problem? In no instance did human trafficking come out as number one. As a matter of fact, over the 400, it averaged either next to last or last place. And this is something that I've seen not only on the college campus was a microcosm of what I saw, for example, at the OSCE over a number of years, where the rhetoric and a seeming seriousness of rhetoric and the appointment of high-level people and special representatives and rapporteurs grows. The number of issues grow. Your TIP report is marvelously expansive in including new forms of trafficking, and yet we are always up against the question of resources. And so my question to you is, how will you help us in the anti-trafficking community, under the guise of partnership, mobilize, push for, ask for, and acquire the resources that are needed to ensure the prosecutions that we're hoping to get, that it's not 500, but maybe, in 5 years, we're looking at 5,000 prosecutions for trafficking, and on and on. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador will have the last word. Go ahead, sir.
I think I'll go backwards. I think that one of the things that we should see as far as the resource allocation is concerned is that so often policymakers look at the baseline issues and then they don't actually go out and look at that next step, which is the funding, the programs, the projects, et cetera. And I think a perfect example in the United States this last year was the passage of the William Wilberforce Act, which was, I think, a very helpful law. It's a very well, I helped write it, so I can't say it was well thought out, but it was certainly thought out. And it was something that a lot of attention got put into, and a lot of the controversies around it were from several camps within the anti-trafficking world, all of whom would agree that we need to have resources and programs and projects, but instead were in an oppositional thing on just a couple of issues within the Wilberforce Act as to how prostitution in the United States would be dealt with. And all of that energy and time and a couple of years worth of back and forth. And in the meanwhile, nobody was going over to talk to the appropriators. And so, in some ways, one of the things that we saw was that civil society, as they engaged on it, were engaging upon the big macro issue of what definitions of trafficking should be, the big macro issues of, how trafficking would interact with another couple of laws in the United States, and not going up to the Hill to make sure that the appropriators knew that that it would be to their peril if they forgot trafficking when it came time to actually do the appropriations. And I think that that's something that we can see in the U.S. anti-trafficking movement as a place that we need to really focus on. I can't really tell everybody to go lobby, but at the same time, I would suggest that some of our energies, rather than simply being on the policy side, need to be on that exact side. What Michelle mentioned is this notion of resources, programs, bodies. The Civil Rights Division, I think people would be shocked if they found out that, and so be shocked, the President's budget, for the first time in 8 years, the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division is going to get more lawyers. The criminal section of the Civil Rights Division has seen an almost tenfold increase in the number of trafficking cases that it has done since the year 2000. The Bush administration touted those. I helped tout it for the Bush administration. And yet, that touting never resulted in more bodies to actually do more cases. And so I think that that's one of the things that we see with the President's budget this year. Hopefully we'll get 8 or 10 new lawyers. That's something that in some ways leads the government of Iraq open to the big question, which is if you care enough about human trafficking, they're using it as justification to constrain women's rights on this front, then why aren't you actually out investigating human trafficking, putting the traffickers out of business, helping victims, et cetera? I think it tends to expose just how serious a government is if they're using human trafficking as an excuse rather than as a call to action. The notion of coercion in many forms at the UN and otherwise, I think one of the things that I'm interested in, and I'm going to start trying to engage with UN and others at the State Department. I think that they need to hear this from the outside world, though, both the executive branch and folks in Congress, is especially in the peacekeeper front, and then building out from there, there needs to be, just like the Tier 3 status on the trafficking report can then have an impact on how the U.S. is supposed to vote in the World Bank and at the other big funding organizations. So too, that notion of when the U.S. And other major countries are voting in the Security Council on peacekeeping operations, it seems to me like having the counter-trafficking effort up front in that resolution, including the notion that the head of the peacekeeping operation would have the ability to discipline, that you don't have the send them home and get them out of there problem, whether it's a uniformed peacekeeper who's being provided or whether it's a UN employee or otherwise. I think that it's that moment of the negotiations around sending in the peacekeeping force is probably the best time to build in a internal affairs capability around trafficking and sexual violence and other issues of that sort. One of the things that we've seen as far as Mexico is concerned is that the relations on human trafficking in law enforcement especially, I think, have been very positive between the United States and Mexico. For the longest time, there was the interpretation of Mexican Constitution to prohibit extradition of Mexican citizens. And one of the places where we first saw movement on that was with human traffickers from Mexico who were enslaving Mexican citizens here in the United States. And that's something that I think that we've felt in the United States is a very positive aspect of our relationship now, especially as we're starting to do more and more joint law enforcement. And I think one of the things that I'll be interested in talking with Ambassador Sadiq Khan about when I get back from Africa and get back with a little more time is how we can continue and intensify that notion of joint law enforcement between the U.S. and Mexico, because I think something around 60 to 65% of the victims that were identified in the DOJ study last year are Latino, and I think, again, around 64% of the U.S. Latino population are Mexican, and so I think that it is something that we've seen a disproportionate number of Mexican citizens victimized in the U.S. Through trafficking. The other report, that's not something that the State Department is doing, but I know that it's something that we've been asking the same question, and I think that the report on the commercial sex in the United States is something that is in its end game, and we're hoping that that's something that's going to be coming out this year. And I think that, just like with that report, we're also hoping, based on the Wilberforce Act, that the FBI uniform crime statistics, I think the report's going to be good, but it's going to just be a snapshot. The fact that the uniform crime reporting statistics from now on are actually going to disaggregate the data on prostitution arrests so that we can tell the difference between the men that are being arrested, the women that are being arrested. The FBI has been mandated to now break out client, pimp, and prostitute. And one of the things that we're hoping is, from a policy perspective, is then we can actually go to the next level of getting real data on, is there the sentencing disparity that we think there is. We are pretty sure that men who are arrested for prostitution offenses in the U.S. end up getting moved into deferred action. Sometimes it doesn't even end up on their record, whereas the women are moved into jail and detention. But that's something that we just kind of think. We're hoping that having that ongoing collection of data by the FBI is going to be something that we can look at, that state policymakers, as they address how they're going to handle prostitution in their particular states, can then have information so that we can close some of those gaps that we, I think, intuitively think are out there right now. And finally, to close with Swaziland, I think that that's exactly what I'm hoping to accomplish next week. And I think that I'll be in touch with your office here in Washington, as well as how we can follow up so that we can make sure that there's that kind of constructive engagement. I think one of the things that happened to a number of countries this year is that as the report, because of the Wilberforce Act, the report changed the threshold number as far as whether a country should be ranked. Instead, this year it was if there is a significant trafficking problem if we needed to look to see whether there were trafficking victims in that country. Before, it had been if there was a quote-unquote significant trafficking problem, and the arbitrary number had been set up that would be 100 known cases. If you end up having a country that's small, like Swaziland, or tiny, like a number of the Caribbean countries, 100 cases of anything in a small country is an awful lot. Whereas 100 cases in a country like China, India, or even the U.S., that might just take a weekend to have 100 cases. So, I think that that's one of the things that, as we, because of Congress, moved away from this 100-case threshold, a number of countries that had not been through the ranking process before this time suddenly were, and I think that's exactly what happened to Swaziland. And so it was very important to me, since I was going to be in Africa, since Swaziland is coming onto the report the way that it did. It's something that I really wanted to take a look at as far as how we can get in quickly so we can have that kind of constructive engagement. Literally me talking to my counterparts from the police and the prosecutor's office and think about, well, how do we investigate these cases, some of which have been Swazi women in South Africa, but then also reports of things happening in Swaziland as well. And so I think it's that notion of sitting down and really thinking, do we get these detectives? Do we get those detectives? Where are we going to look? How are we going to find them? And so that's why I'm going next week.
Thank you. 2 o'clock. With these informative answers, I will bring this 13th embassy luncheon to a closure. I want to thank Elaine Panter and the Protection Project Research Associates for producing the review of the report. I want to thank you, Mr. Ambassador, representatives of different embassies, the audience, everyone who came and participated, everyone who asked a question, including Professor Ruth Woodsworth, everybody. And I look forward to 2010, another report and another presentation and insights from Ambassador Baca. Thank you so much.